Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled Threats, Vulnerabilities, and Risks, Identifying the Highest Priorities. A few housekeeping notes we would like to mention. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Following the presentation, we will have a brief question and answer session. Please submit your questions at any time using the chat interface on your screen. To kick off today's event, I'd like to turn the floor over to Rick Schumard, Vice President and Utility Services. Rick, welcome to the event. You have the floor and should have control.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Welcome to everyone for the second in a series of 4 Leidos webinars on the topic of physical security. This episode is going to deal with threats, vulnerabilities, and risks. And before we get into the meat of those topics, I would like to take a moment and introduce myself and my colleagues who are subject matter experts for the day. I'm Vice President for Utility Services for Leidos, and I work primarily with investor-owned utility clients across the country. Prior to joining Leidos, I spent 28 years with the Electric Power Research Institute in advanced technology sales and applications. Steve Schneider, who has been on the webcast with us previously, is the Chief Solutions Architect and Director of Technology Integration for Leidos Engineering. He's responsible for creating new business models that meet complex new business requirements, a perfect example of which being the NERC CIP physical security regulations. Steve has over 2 decades of investor-owned utility experience. Joining us for the first time in this series today is Steve Filio, who offers more than 25 years of continuous and uninterrupted military, law enforcement, and intelligence community service. He currently manages the international security, counterintelligence, and corporate espionage and investigations programs for Leidos. Also joining us for the first time is Gib Sorbo. Gib is Chief Cybersecurity Technologist for Leidos and has more than 20 years of project management and technical experience on information security projects for government and private sector organizations in the energy, defense, healthcare, and financial sectors. He has managed and participated in system security certification and accreditation, penetration testing, and vulnerability assessments. Leidos is entering into the discussion around physical security because we feel that we offer a unique perspective to utility security. First, we have decades of experience in critical national security infrastructure. We've been performing national security activities since our founding in 1969, which includes cybersecurity, force protection, and electronic security systems. We have more than 70 years of utility engineering experience going back to our heritage from R.W. Beck & Associates and Patrick Energy Services. Additionally, we have performed physical security post 9/11 on several airports, seaports, and numerous critical Department of Defense installations. We look at security as the convergence of national security into the power and electricity sectors. And our background in this arena gives us a really broad view of the NERC CIP 14 regulations and the potential evolution of these guidelines. Just by quick review, our session on September 25th gave a broad overview of what NERC CIP 14 entailed and covered the 6 requirements of the CIP. Today's topic addresses our thoughts about the threat, vulnerability, and risk assessment step of the CIP, which is requirement number 4. We hope that you'll continue to join us for our remaining 2 webcasts as well, where on October 23rd we'll identify how to develop a security plan based on your threat and vulnerability assessment. And on November 6th, we'll take a look at ways to optimize your investment while also meeting some of your other organizational goals. In this slide, you can see the 6 requirements defined by NERC to make up the Critical Infrastructure Protection Program. Prior to the threat and vulnerability assessment, you will have first completed the requirements 1 through 3, which are performing your initial assessment, completing an independent review of that assessment, and coordinating between the operator and the owner of the utility if necessary. As I mentioned, today's presentation focuses on requirement 4, performing a threat and vulnerability assessment. This requirement is one of the most significant steps in creating a security plan, and we felt that it was important enough to warrant its own session. Utilities will need a really comprehensive and well-thought-out threat and vulnerability assessment on which to base the development of their security plan. As my colleague Steve Schneider pointed out in our last webcast, this is where the rubber meets the road. So without further ado, we'll get right into the meat of the topic, and I would like to turn it over to Steve Filio for the next section. Steve?
Thank you, Rick. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before I get too far into the topic, just a little bit more on my background so that you understand my perspective. I spent the bulk of my law enforcement career in SWAT here in Washington. When I retired 11 years ago, I went into the intelligence community and spent most of those years in counterintelligence, anti-terrorism force protection, and target analysis vulnerability assessment. It's something we've made that those of us scheming to penetrate fortified locations would also be good at protecting them, and that was my entree into that work. In 2006, the Department of Energy carried out a high-level industry-wide vulnerability analysis that identified high-voltage transformers and transmission control centers as major electric grid vulnerabilities. Now, how was it that transformers were identified as a major grid vulnerability? The reason's very simple. Taking out a high-voltage transformer or substation can cause significant grid stability issues. Because the U.S. grid is so highly interconnected, one equipment failure can have a cascading effect on a significant portion of the grid. The sad part is that, unfortunately, this has become common knowledge among those wishing to do us harm. Making matters worse is that transformers and substations were not initially designed or built to protect against attacks, and in many cases, that is plainly visible. Additionally, transformers are difficult to move with significant logistics and permitting required. They're often difficult to repair in space or in place. Spares are limited, and obtaining new ones take forever. The PG&E Metcalf substation incident in 2013 was a very big wake-up call to the utilities, as it was a perfect example of a realized transformer vulnerability. Thus, the NERC requirements have been established for this very topic. NERC CIP 14 directly focuses and dives down into the critical system transformers and control center vulnerabilities per the R1 requirement. Over the next few slides, we'll explore vulnerability, threat, risk analysis, and describe them in plain English for you. So let's dive into it. This is a prescribed first step, and it is more important, or it is vitally important, as it forms the basis of your strategic plan and infrastructure investment requirements. There needs to be a credible method undertaken to justify expenses to protect, and that will be the last stage of this. So a threat assessment is very important in the beginning, an absolute must-to-have. So at a very high level, you're considering who can hurt me, why do they want to hurt me, do they have the capability to hurt me, and after these questions are answered, we ask, what are my vulnerabilities, what is my risk, what are my countermeasures, how can I deter, detect, and delay. So your risk management plan is the sum of the threat and vulnerability assessment plus the risk assessment, and it starts, and I got to emphasize start, with a credible threat assessment. Ultimately, you want to think like the bad guy as to how to hurt the asset, assess the vulnerability and risk for actionable results, and then address the results appropriately. That is the subject of countermeasures, and that will be discussed in our next presentation. So let's start with some basics. It's important to understand these. These words, unfortunately, are used incorrectly and are not interchangeable by definition, but you often hear that in discussions. So we start with an adversary. What is an adversary? That's relatively simple to define. It can be as simple as a grumpy person or a group that would like to harm you. An adversary only becomes a threat if they have made that stated intent, but they also have the capability to actually harm you. This is determined by the threat assessment, and it absolutely must be done first. It may be a national threat, like a common denominator among all electric utilities nationwide, or a particular local threat to a particular utility. Once a threat has been identified, vulnerability of the assets are assessed against the identified threats, and this will be a unique consideration for each identified vulnerable asset. What we are looking for here is, are there any existing single points of failure that are vulnerable? And you see the picture of the bike on the screen. I want to use that as an example. An adversary is someone who might want to steal your bicycle. A threat to your bicycle would be an adversary with intent to steal your bike and the capability to do so. So you leave your bicycle outside leaning up against the side of the garage while you go inside to fill up your water bottle. Your vulnerability in this case is pretty high. You've left something desirable in an unprotected place. An adversary may see the bike, know that he wants to steal it, that's his intent, and that he has the capability to hop on your bike and ride away. Now, that's a very oversimplified example, but there's components to it that are important for your consideration. How would this apply? How would this simple model apply to an electric utility? And quite frankly, it's one of these things where if you do a risk assessment, let's take the guy in the bike, moves to a new neighborhood, he uses his bike for transportation and recreation. His threat assessment might be checking with the local civic association, homeowners association, the local police, and finding out if theft of bicycles is a problem. Well, the local people, or the people that are good at threat assessments, would be able to see if there is any pattern of bikes being stolen. You find out perhaps that there's a couple of youth groups, not gangs, but kids that are actively stealing bicycles. They're selling them cheap, or they're literally using them like they use in college campuses these days. Ride them to your next location, dump them, steal another bike, and move on. Well, now you have the dilemma of, dealing with your own bike or your kids' bikes that often dumped in the front yard or in the backyard or left unattended. Well, that's wide open to being stolen. In your case, many of those situations, you won't even be able to get your homeowner's insurance to replace the bike because you left it wide open when you knew you lived in an area where there was a bicycle theft problem. So we can apply it to we can apply the simple model to a much larger situation. So we'll simplify the components of this threat and vulnerability assessment. Who is your adversary? Why? And we use the who, what, when, how, where, and why because everybody understands it. It's simple, and it gets the point across. So why is the intent to harm? How is the capability? What is the attack vector? And when and where, those will be determined by the vulnerable points. Let me use another example of this. When I first started doing this kind of work, after 9/11, the EPA mandated assessments on Tier 1, 2, and 3 water systems. We had to go down to Petersburg, Virginia to do an assessment on their Tier 3 water system. Now, for those of you who don't know, Petersburg, Virginia is a kind of crime-ridden, high poverty rate, not a good tax base. When we met with the Public Works Director, he was very concerned that whatever went down on paper was going to harm him. They'd never be able to afford to make the repairs. They'd be liable, and he was very, very concerned about that. We kind of explained to him, I said, look, just approach this from common sense and help you get across the goal line. What are your critical assets? What can you absolutely not live with being taken out by an attack or a problem? And for him, it was the local hospital and the schools. The best way to get the point across was to use an industry standard that we call the crap to worth ratio. This guy's got a finished supply of water in a water tank. Look at that as perhaps your utility. We weren't going to make any recommendations overcomplicated. We were going to study what the real threat was. And in his situation, the threat to a finished water supply might be somebody trying to contaminate the water supply. So trying to explain to him that the amount of contaminant that would have to go into a finished water tank is quite high, but for the purpose of the discussion, it was common in some of those areas for people to try to dump like dead deer carcasses into the water tank. So in kind of explaining it, that that's a threat in that area, let's look what's vulnerable. The finished water supply tanks were vulnerable. How can you fix them simply? How can you fix them affordably? How do you determine the threat, the vulnerability, and the risk? Simply, it was suggested, clear the brush, mow the grass, put up an 8-foot fence with a barbed wire outrigger on it, put a good lock on the gate, maybe a camera on the water tank looking back at the gate, and inside the ladder that goes up the side, the access ladder to the top of the tank, you put a very inexpensive anti-personnel grate on it, and at the very top, you put a substantial lock on the access hatch to the finished water supply. Those very simple things, in understanding the threat, in understanding the vulnerability, and in understanding the risk, you're able to apply some very common sense techniques to significantly tilt the crap to worth ratio in favor of the utility. So that's hopefully trying to get the point across about threat, vulnerability, and risk a little bit better. Doing the threat assessment has to be done at the local level. While there may exist threats common to all electric utilities everywhere, there may be threats particular to the local area. The insider threat is always an issue, and it's across the board. This must be considered everywhere. Most threat, vulnerability, and risk assessment methodologies always list the insider threat as one of the most dangerous threats. So it's recognized across the board, and it must be considered and should be done by threat, vulnerability, and risk assessment SMEs. I'll give you another example. After 9/11, everybody, and especially when DHS was making money available like it was candy, people wanted this, they wanted that to protect them against all of these perceived threats. And originally you heard everybody was scared about the terrorists using a nuclear threat against us in a large population center. People were scrambling to prepare for that, and by every credible risk assessment methodology out there, a nuclear threat is the absolute worst. It does have the highest impact, but it really isn't a threat. When you look at the enemy's capability, even though they said that they want to hurt us using nuclear threat, they don't have the capability yet to significantly launch any kind of a nuclear attack. So all of a sudden, you find that you're not vulnerable to that. So there's no sense placing any money. There's no risk to your system from a nuclear attack. You kind of put it back in perspective. And another example that we ran across was whether it was nuclear or chemical or biological attacks, there were big concerns that first responders wouldn't be capable of doing that. So you have examples of small fire departments in Podunk, Wyoming, that has an 8-man fire department, and every one of them got a level 5 biohazard response suit, which sounds really good until you realize that fire department will never deal with a chem bio kind of situation. So again, it was money spent needlessly because the threat, vulnerability, and the risk was never taken into consideration ahead of time. So threat considerations for the energy sector. Again, common sense thing, we've got to look at it from the local level as well as the national level. So you have to ask yourself these questions. What's happened to your neighbor? What's happened to other utilities? What are the common denominators? You have to take, if you identify threats, you have to take them seriously, so you kind of look at it from that perspective. You always have to keep the insider threat high. One of the most damaging things is the disgruntled insider in collusion with an outside threat, somebody that has stated an intent and a capability. And as we all know, we're all dealing these days with the unfortunate effects of what Edward Snowden did, a disgruntled guy who made lots of information public to hurt us. He's an insider guy, insider threat, identified early on, could have prevented some serious problems. So how do you do a threat assessment? And this will be done by whoever comes to do the local threat assessments. Open source intelligence is an obvious first choice. Utilities can use OSINT, open source intelligence, to look for potential threat factors that exist in their local area. Perhaps it's an environmental group nearby, somebody that's stated an intent and may have a capability. But the other thing to remember is that the bad guys are also trolling OSINT for information that can be used against a utility. There's a risk assessment methodology you commonly use in the Department of Defense called OPSEC, for operations, not operational, but operations security. And one of the things that's stressed in there is an examination of whether it's a DoD asset or a business or a utility. What in the marketing has been made public? What has the utility put online about their capabilities? One of the greatest strengths of the United States is also one of our biggest weaknesses, and that means we're a very open society. We like to tell you how good we are. We like to tell our customer bases. The different things that we can do for them. And in some cases, it's even been noticed on open source intelligence that entire natural gas distribution systems are actually, the drawings for them are actually online. That really makes it very easy for somebody to hurt you if you do most of the homework for them. So you have to also understand that when it comes to examining OSINT, if it's out there already, you have to assume that the bad guys have it. So examining what you're listing out there is also important. And in the future, you have to be careful about what you put out there to protect against this. Listed on the left side of the screen there is the word Carver. That's also a target analysis vulnerability assessment methodology. And I'm going to explain it to you not to pitch Carver necessarily, but it's a very easy example to get the point across about threat, vulnerability, and risk. In the acronym, C stands for criticality. Well, that's already been done in the R1 requirement. The critical assets have already been identified, and the requirements have been written towards that. So we busy ourselves with the next part of it, the accessibility of the asset, the recognizability of the asset, the vulnerability of the asset, the effect on the system if that asset goes down, and the recoverability of something happening to that asset. So applied to the utility, the electric utility specifically, it's a question of assessing, is the asset accessible? Is it easily accessible? And we know that many of these assets in the electric utility are. Can a bad guy recognize them pretty simply by getting in there, having relatively easy access and being able to recognize them from a distance? Because there lacks some physical security, perhaps, is it vulnerable? And I go back to the water system example where the recommendation was, look, cut back the brush, mow the grass, put up a fence, and put an anti-personnel gate on the ladder, and 90% of your problems go away. Also with the electric utility, the effect. We know what that can lead to in a cascading situation. And as far as recoverability, we know that it's very, very difficult to repair in place transformers or even get a new one in a timely fashion. So thinking like the bad guy is extra important. Once you understand what and who you're up against, you can review your assets against their stated intent. You can review your assets against the stated intentions of the bad guys and their methods of operation, and that's what reveals your vulnerabilities. So risk equals threat, vulnerability, and impact. And as you can see by the pictures on the screen, it kind of simplifies it specifically for the electric utility. In this one, it's very easy to define risk. Risk is the impact on the customer base and the stability of the grid. What assets absolutely cannot be compromised? What can you live with? What would cause irreparable harm? And then the utility has to honestly answer the question, is it part of the problem or part of the solution, the proactive solution in meeting these requirements? And lastly, here's a list of some of the existing methodologies for determining threat, vulnerability, and risk. There are several of them out there. I think what's important for utilities to be concerned with is having security SMEs with background and experience that have enough background and experience where they can take the best of the best from these methodologies, much like a chef would create a culinary masterpiece by blending different spices and techniques in the kitchen. Your solutions will be individually applied to the situation at each location by the experts with a track record of exceeding expectations using these credible and competent risk assessment methodologies. So with that, I'll turn this over to my colleague, Steve Schneider.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it. So we know that CIP 014 is all about focusing on and mitigating the threats and vulnerabilities associated with high voltage transformers and control centers, which were deemed critical under the requirement 1. And again, that means if they're rendered inoperable and they have a significant impact to the stability of the system, and then CIP 014 looks at them. Now this diagram here shows a rendering of a simple high voltage transformer that's been identified as a critical facility under CIP 014. And this is one of the primary targets of a group of people or an adversary with the intent and capability of harming you. Now, these are some real-world examples that have actually been seen with regards to a threat and or vulnerability associated with a substation. So the first one I know that's all in our heads is obviously a coordinated transformer attack, like what happened out at Metcalf with you know, the high ballistic bullets going in and penetrating the casing for oil leakage. But just as there's other, you know, vulnerabilities. There's, you know, unauthorized access, breaching the fence, you know, theft of materials, the ability to get into a substation and basically interfere with the proper operation is important. Transmission lines. There was a failed attempt down in Arkansas and Louisiana that there was a disgruntled employee, and as Steve mentioned, you know, an insider threat, if you will, who tried to pull down a transmission line serving a substation by attaching a guy wire in front of a train. The control house. The control house is the brains of the substation, and obviously if you impact the control house, you're going to have significant impact. Again, there was another incident where somebody drove through the fence, lit his truck on fire, and damaged the control center. And as Gib Sorbo will be talking a little bit later, there's also a big cyber component. You know, there's been recently in the Wall Street Journal a campaign by, you know, East Europe Energetic Bear to be able to go in and try and hack the control systems of the U.S. utility. So, as Steve had mentioned earlier, when we look at the vulnerabilities, we need to put ourselves into the mindset of the group trying to damage us and consider what this malicious person, group, or nation state or hacker is really trying to focus on. So thinking like the bad guy is important when establishing a robust security plan. So what are the bad guys going to ask themselves? How can I hurt, or what can I hurt to cause the greatest impact or damage? How can I get access in to be able to go and do it? Can I damage the energy supply to the substation? Can I damage the controls so that the substation doesn't work properly? Can I hack into the computer systems to gain control, provide misinformation, confuse, disable components, that are essential to the safe operations of the systems. Now, we know there's a whole lot of other vulnerabilities and methods of attack and attack vectors that are out there in substations. And each utility has their own specific, while these are common vulnerabilities, there will be unique situations for your service territory, the location. Is it near a highway? Is it away from a highway? That really go into the threats and vulnerabilities associated with that. But you need to put yourself in the process of how does the bad guy think. Now, we know from the actual verbiage that came out in SIP that it's both a flexible and a structured framework for the threats and or reacting to these critical natures. So it's structured in the sense, SIP is structured that it has 6 requirements with a predefined classification of what is critical, and it has an independent third-party audit assessment in 2 parts. One is to figure out what are the critical elements, and the second one is to overlook the threats, vulnerabilities, and implementation plans. Interestingly enough, the flexibility, though, does not specify a discrete threats and vulnerability and risk assessment methodologies. That's good in the sense that flexibility allows the utilities to craft their customized responses as they relate to their unique service territory parameters, such as number of critical element, substations, is it rural, is it urban, what's the first responder's distance, what's your relationship with the first responder, what's your spare equipment availability. There's a whole host, have you recently had a layoff, just looking at all types of, conditions with regard to the threat. Now we know, and there are a lot of threats and vulnerability and risk assessment protocols that exist. I mean, and a couple that are out there. Steve went over Carver. There's Thyro. There's RAME, CRM. DoD has one. DHS has one. Regardless of what method you use, the end goal is the same, and that is to keep the grid up so that if something happens, it can respond, and essentially, keep the critical element up. The art of performing the threats and vulnerability and risk assessments, though, is to understand the nuances, the strengths and weaknesses of each protocol, how they fit into it, what are your resources, what are your timelines, how are your interactions with your PUC. All those go into basically customizing the right development security plan to address SIP 014. Now, this is actually where developing a plan with a group that has both a strong utility and a security background comes into play, because they can balance both. So as you're looking out for your R4 and R5 consultants you work with, we think that being able to ensure that you bring both a strong utility expertise or the ability to understand how the system works along with the security piece, those two really need to be blended together, or you're neutering your plan from the get-go. Now, we all know resources are a constraint, and again, I used to work for a utility about 20 years, and whenever I had a new implementation plan or a requirement or a program came out, I always asked for more money than what I got. And so what we need to do is sit back and ensure that the response we have for SIP 014 is balanced, measured, and rational against the resource plan and the timelines that each utility has. Obviously, if money were no object, it'd be fine, but we need to figure out the following questions really to set up a well-layered, multi-dimensional security plan. Again, what types and how much level of protection do you need? And you see in the picture there, you've got, all the way from a high robust, razor wire, and this is obviously a tongue-in-cheek example, though, around a prison, to, some removable barrier walls to a fence. Which one is right for the amount of money to get the biggest bang for the buck and the reaction that what you need? How much is not enough? How much is enough? How much technology, how much hardening, and how many people were needed to do it? Now, one of the concepts is we suggest that when you put your threat and vulnerability and risk assessment together, that you do it so that it's metricized, and that you can actually use the various outputs of that to be able to put that in versus a pure knee-jerk threats and vulnerability reaction, which is why go back and using Thrive, some of the existing protocols are out there. That's how we answer those questions. Now, again, those assessments from R4's threats and vulnerabilities will provide the route for the security implementation. That is R5. Now, I've been talking a lot about physical security over the last few slides, and Steve went over the high-level look at what the threats and vulnerability. I do want to slightly pivot our discussion, however, because it's obvious we know CIP 014 is about physical security. That said, a multi-layered comprehensive security plan should also address cybersecurity and their components, as it will invariably be integrated into the physical security. In fact, if you actually read the Wall Street Journal this morning, there was a talk about cyber threats and how it tied into the electric utility. And everyone from Congress, the Senate, and even your local leadership, and I'm sure you as unique individual utilities are thinking about that. So I'm sure in the back of your head you're asking, what's about cyber? So I wanted to introduce Gib Sorbo, our Chief Cyber Technologist, to take us through a high-level look of the cyber element, the threats and vulnerabilities, and his perspectives on it. So Gib, I'm going to kick it over to you now.
All right, thanks, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, cybersecurity is a component of this, and it's not simply about cyber as another thing that we have to take care of, but it's very closely related to some of your cybersecurity threats, some of your physical security threats, I should say. This is largely because cyber is a way in which attackers who are desiring to do physical harm may choose to gather information. They may also choose to distract your attention or disrupt things while they're launching a physical attack. This is a well-known methodology. It's what the Russians used in Georgia back several years ago. It's what is being used in many countries around the world where they're looking at kinetic attacks. Cyber is one element of that, and it's only going to continue to get worse as our attackers become more sophisticated, as well as we see more of them. And of course, cyber is something that a lot of people have that capability because it's worldwide, and you can launch an attack from your basement sitting in your pajamas and don't have to get up and do things. And there is some physical impacts to those cyber attacks, but for this discussion, a cyber attack is also intricately connected to the physical attack, and it's something that people should be aware of. Most cyber attacks are relatively simple. They're oftentimes automated, and so some of the very basic hygiene and basic protections for your network need to be applied. As the picture depicts, an open door is obviously a lot less secure than a locked door. Doesn't mean that you can't get your way into that lock, particularly the one shown in the picture, but it's going to take some extra time. And if the attacker is a low-skilled individual, they may choose to have the easier target, or if they're simply gathering lots of information from lots of different targets, being able to at least provide enough security to cause them to go for an easier target may be something that you should look into. Obviously, if they want to get something from you and it's something that's very important to them, they're going to spend their time, and they're probably going to get into some parts of your network. And so having some methodology around the types of threats you're looking at and being able to think about the types of impacts you're most worried about and think of it in that context is incredibly important. But unlike natural phenomenon, cyber and physical attacks take into account a defender's counter defenses. And so while a tornado doesn't intentionally attack a trailer park because it's the weakest area where the most damage can be done, a cyber attacker or a physical attacker will look to get in the easiest way possible and will take into account any countermeasures that you've implemented in ways that it can best defend them, which means that you end up having a bit of a leapfrog, which each side decides to employ greater defenses or greater offensive capabilities. And unfortunately, that's the way things work. And if the organization is well funded, they're going to keep pounding away and being able to continue to launch those attacks over time. And unfortunately, the way that most utilities and most industries are set up, these attacks are not detected. So while you walk by a door and you can see that it's open or you can see that somebody broke in, oftentimes there is not any sign that an attacker has gotten in or has tried to break in. In fact, many of the most publicized breaches lately from Target and Home Depot and others, we've seen the evidence, the information that is being about the attack is actually coming from law enforcement or intelligence sources. They're telling the end asset owner, or in this case retailers, you've been attacked because we're seeing credit card numbers in these credit card dump sites that are associated with transactions that happened at your facility over the last 6 months. And so it's important that we improve not only our defenses in locking doors and locking firewalls and other components of our infrastructure, but we also improve our ability to detect those things and, of course, respond to those afterwards. So part of the issue with cyber attackers is just like physical attackers, but probably even more so with cyber attackers, is the wide variety of them. If you have somebody shooting bullets at a substation, generally they fall into some more either criminal elements or some sort of other more sophisticated type of attacker. Yes, there will be random shots fired by somebody that's been drinking too much, or even kids, but the types of dedicated and determined attack that we've seen recently is obviously more limited in their skill set. Whereas in cyberspace, we see hackers of all kinds, and unfortunately, because of the tools that are out there, some of the most least skilled attackers are able to launch attacks that can do a lot of damage, that can break in and steal lots of information because they're automated and they can do things in a way that can pull out a lot of additional information out of those organizations. But looking at that scale, we usually break adversaries down into an area of both capability and motivation. As Steve Filio had indicated earlier, you look at their intent, you look in their capabilities, and that helps to define the threat. And so for a bored teenager, for example, they may have some motivation, at least for a period of time, but they don't have a lot of skills, and they certainly don't have a lot of resources in order to launch those attacks. They're going to have whatever they can download for free on the internet and launch some sorts of attacks. So but whereas a nation state or even a sophisticated criminal enterprise, if you have something that they really want, they're going to deploy lots of resources over long periods of time. And what we've seen frequently in the electric utility industry and also in other parts of the energy industry, as Steve Snyder noted with Energetic Bear and some of the most recent attacks, there's been information in the news recently about a new campaign called Black Energy. And so a lot of these things are not necessarily around destroying or disrupting infrastructure, but around obtaining access and maintaining state in that organization for long periods of time. And it's open to speculation what their intent may be. In some industries like oil and gas, there may be intellectual property theft, but in cases like utilities, it's simply having access and having a launch pad to do something worse if the geopolitical circumstances merit, or if there's other circumstances that suddenly they discover now we can make money off of this, such as a new energy exchange opens and they're able now to predict energy prices going forward and they can bet on those. And so thinking forward in time about what may happen in the grid in the future is also one of the things these criminal enterprises are doing, as well as simply being able to maintain access. They may even try to sell that access in the future to something else, because we've seen that with hackers in other areas where they decide that I have access and now I have value and I can sell it to whoever, a terrorist group or a nation state or somebody that's not as sophisticated but still wants to do that damage. And we've seen a lot of that proxy sorts of attacks and how they were able to do that. So it's frequently a challenge to figure out exactly how they're going to do it. And they're going to use a variety of methods. They're going to use phishing attacks, emails, try to get people to click on things, which is really the most effective way in most cases to get into an enterprise, and then work themselves around the organization until they find something that's interesting. Also web attacks and session hijacking and other things. We've seen some recent vulnerabilities such as Heartbleed, which For the end of the industry, fortunately, at least for electric utilities, was not that bad of an issue for sometimes the wrong reasons. Heartbleed affected a website and its ability to protect encrypted information. Well, we found out that most utilities and most industrial control systems are not using encrypted traffic. So they're sending things off in the clear, and while they're not vulnerable to Heartbleed, they were already vulnerable to sending those things off in the clear. And some of the more recent threats are also indicative of the things that we need to worry about. They become more widespread and more automated. So as we can see from this chart, both the countermeasures, what you and I do as defenders, and what attackers are using is constantly being ratcheted up. When we apply one particular control, we see another control another attack that is used to launch those sorts of things. So when we have firewall, someone will say, well, I put a firewall in place so somebody can't get in. Even if the firewall is effective, they're still letting email in. And so somebody can click on a link, download that information, and most enterprises allow you to allow traffic to go out, and so they can become infected and information can be exfiltrated out, and an attacker can then control things within the organization. So it's knowing your adversaries and what they're likely to target will be very important. So if it's an extremely important asset, they're going to go further up on this attack vector line and use more sophisticated attacks to do that, because they're going to gain more financially or geopolitically or what have you through their attack. On the other hand, if it's not as valuable to the attacker and it's something that they'll just simply do as sort of a drive-by attack, then your defenses may not have to be as strong. And that's similar to what we see in the physical world, where if you have a significant transmission substation that would have a significant impact on the grid if it went down, there should be more physical protection there. There should be cameras and motion detectors and other capabilities. And quite frankly, a lot of those should exist in other substations, but your priority is in these larger substations that have those capabilities. The same is true in the cyber world. And even to the point where some of your most critical assets in the cyber world, you may physically isolate them, not allow any sort of access. That's sort of what the Iranians did in trying to thwart attacks. And of course, Stuxnet was able to get past them through somebody carrying a USB flash drive. And so it's important that we understand what those threats are, understand how important those assets are, and what we can do to defend it. So the other thing about it is, of course, utilities are multifaceted. You are trying to you are also trying to protect other things in your enterprise, and the types of things you're protecting will depend on the controls as well. So, for example, if you're trying to protect customer data, your most important priority may be confidentiality. You want to keep their social security numbers, their credit card numbers, their other information from getting stolen, because oftentimes that's what's most valuable to the attacker, and that would do most damage if it was released. On the other end, your control systems, there's not a whole lot of need for confidentiality beyond the passwords and other data that describes the systems, but the actual output or what they're doing is fairly common in the industry, and everyone is very aware of what this particular PLC or other device does. And so what's most important is maintaining these things operational, keeping the availability up. And secondarily, the integrity, which actually is sometimes more important, because it's having a device operate improperly is oftentimes worse than it being unavailable or stop operating altogether. And we can see that when something gets damaged, if pressure or heat gets too high at a power plant and a boiler or something else like that, we know the damage could be much greater than if simply the plant shut down. And so we need to be also aware of that as well. So with that in context and understanding all these issues, I'm going to turn it back over to Rick Schumar, who will close this out for us.
Thank you, Gid. Appreciate it very much. At this point, we've spent about the last 45, 50 minutes covering the R4, which is the Threat and Vulnerability Assessment of the proposed SIP program. Just a moment, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty. There we go. This is a critically important step, and it sets the stage for the remainder of the SIP requirements. Earlier on when I was speaking, I mentioned the next 2 episodes, and you can see those on this slide. We would encourage you to join us if you're available for that. Before I turn it over to PJ to run the question and answer session, I would like to, PJ, can you advance that slide for me? I seem to be having difficulty. Thank you. I'd like to give you our contact information for the 4 of us, and also at the bottom you will see a link where you can get a copy of today's presentation. So with that, we thank you for your time. Hope you'll stay with us during the question and answer session for the next few minutes. We have some really good questions already. Thanks.
Sounds good. So, hey, this is Steve Schneider, so I'll be moderating the questions for us real quick. I know we're running up on a little, potentially some short on time, so I did want to know, if for those who have submitted questions online and we did not get to the answers, we will follow up with you on email as a follow-up, so rest assured your questions will be answered by us. So the first question we got was, hey, how resilient should a utility company be, and what elements are necessary for an efficient recovery plan? So in theory, you would love to have as absolute maximum resiliency as you can in a utility. In reality, we know we are bounded by the resource and constraints that occur out there. So that's why it's really incumbent upon to do a very good threats and vulnerability and risk assessment to see what your highest probability or your risk points are and how to mitigate them with the most effective means to be able to essentially get the best response that you can for the money that you put out or the resources that you put out. Now, what components should be considered, or what elements are essential? One is that you know, what is your equipment? How can you get your equipment out? Having a good interactive response plan with your first responders, having your communication protocol set up ahead of time. As you continue and build out your system, plan resiliency with regards to interoperability switching capabilities so that your system can be minimally impacted. Also go out and ensure in your recovery plan or your plan that you keep your PUC directly involved so that that comes. So I'm going to tie a second question into that, which is, hey, rate recovery around PUCs. We look at the SIP 014 plan as being a good, regulated, structured plan to be able to put together a reasonable response plan for your SIP 014 with appropriate timelines and resources put in. The fact that that is structured and run through FERC and NERC, and that we believe the intent is to actually have these security plans covered under rate recovery or have a cost recovery, tying those together so that you can actually appropriately go back and work with your PUCs to be able to go out and get rate recovery is important. Rick, I don't know if you want to put a perspective on that other than the high-level read I just gave.
I think just on the first question about resiliency, most utilities have in place mutual assistance programs for things like hurricanes and tornadoes and other natural disasters. I'm sure they will continue to play a role for physical security as well. And then there are a lot of strategic alliances between utilities and major equipment manufacturers, and all of those things taken together allow utilities to adopt a bend but don't break philosophy. So we think those are very important.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, that also one of the large IOUs that we're directly working with actually is tying together a resiliency plan and a security plan into their substation and security reactions, so that they're doing a multi-pronged event, so that it's not just pure security, but they're tying in at the resiliency so they could tie the two together and get a 1 + 1 = 3. So that may be a consideration as you put together your security plan as a way to potentially get greater benefit. There's a quick question. I used the term metricized. What did I mean by that? My Baltimore accent may have come through, but metricized basically means that you put together a plan that has metrics embedded into it. so that you can get discrete, quantifiable data and tie it into your response. So, again, my apologies for a garbled Baltimore accent. Gib, this is a a question that came in with regards to cyber. Someone throws over to you. If a cyber hacker or attacker is identified as causing the problem, what's the probability that the hacker or the team of hackers will be caught or severely punished, or how do you mitigate that, or you mitigate a known hacker?
Well, it depends on where the hacker is located. The FBI and law enforcement in the United States has done a very good job of closing down and shutting down campaigns and other groups that have been launching significant attacks. We've seen information about arrests of people, members of Anonymous, which are an hacktivist group. A lot of other groups operating in the United States have also been targeted and have been able to be prosecuted or arrested and prosecuted. So the biggest problem is most of these attacks are being initiated outside the United States. Most news media is reporting Russia and China being behind that. In Russia, it may not be the Russian government, but the government is sort of allowing that. So it's highly unlikely that you will be able to arrest and prosecute people attacking from these other countries. We did see some news lately that the FBI had put in an arrest warrant for some agents of the People's Liberation Army in China. It's unlikely, though, that they will ever show up in a U.S. court. And there's been a few arrests. We had one recently in Malta, and where the Maldives, where a Russian was arrested there. And so some of our law enforcement can get fairly creative about arresting these sort of foreigners when they're in countries sympathetic to the United States. But if they decide to stay in China or Russia, it's unlikely that we will ever be able to bring them to justice.
Great. Thanks, Gib. Of course, it always goes to say that your best defense is basically minimizing your risk by doing your appropriate measures on the front. This is also a question I guess Gib and I are both going to answer. Gib, the first question is, and you could probably hit this up quickly, is, hey, how many hacks do you think actually occurred during a year on or hacked attacks? So that's question number one. The second question is, and with regards to physical and cybersecurity, and we know there's information technology, operation technology. How does that all apply together in a convergence? So, Gib, I'm going to give you the first shot at answering how many hacks attack, and then you could give your perspective on IT-OT convergence, and I'll round out my perspectives and run Rick in for a perspective also.
Yeah, there's no real easy way to detect that. The way attacks work, you have thousands or millions of them. They're going on all the time over the Internet where people are probing and trying to get in, and depending on your definition, they could all be considered an attack because somebody's attempting to break in. Even successful attacks we're finding are in the thousands, if not millions, in organizations. In part because a lot of these tools are automated. You have botnets and other things that will automatically break into different systems in order to steal information or do things, and so there's really a lot of those sorts of things. And then if you consider things like denial of service attacks, well, then you're talking, again, a large number of people. So it not only do we not really have an answer to that, but it's also not particularly interesting unless you get more specific about the types of attacks. Fortunately, we have not seen any cyber attack that has caused physical damage or has shut down a utility operation by the hacker. Now, there's cases where utilities in response to an attack will shut things down, but for the most part, we are not seeing the sort of Stuxnet type attacks in the United States or other things, or the utility power being taken offline as a result of attack. Not yet, but that is eventually going to get to that point if the attackers, number one, have the desire to do it, number two, are able to find their way through the operation technology side to do it. And so I think that those sorts of things, looking at the impact and understanding how many of those incidents we've had, is probably more interesting, and we've been fortunate not to have those yet.
Right. Hey, I'm going to pump up real quick. There was a question that came in for Steve. Steve, you mentioned that you had a SWAT counterintelligence background. Can you give us just a few perspectives on engaging local law enforcement with regards to threats and vulnerability analysis?
The engaging local law enforcement is actually can accomplish a couple of different things. One, it's one of the best sources for threat assessment, for getting information on what's going on locally. The other part of it is when I heard Rick mention like the mutual aid agreements that exist between certain utilities for after-action things. Law enforcement also likes to get involved, and they can be a kind of a quasi part of your response team by incorporating local law enforcement into the security plan, by giving them opportunities to use the facility to train for the types of things you could be up against. They actually love those things for the most part, and you find them to be eager participants in your plan.
Great, sounds good. One last quick question, and I got one, and then we'll basically go from there. Give over to you. Is there a central source of cyber attack information utilities can help anticipate what may happen?
Well, there are several central sources. One of the key ones is ICS CERT, Industrial Control Systems, Computer Emergency Response Team. Actually, I'm out here in Idaho Falls right now, and they're based right here. And they provide a lot of very useful information, and they are a place where if you do experience an incident, you should inform them, as well, of course, as the ISAC under NERC. But those resources have been very good at consolidating them, and then you have various ISACs, information sharing and advisory centers that collect this information. We have things such as the Industrial Control Systems ISAC, the Energy Sector ISAC, and we certainly can provide anyone that's interested with more information on that. A lot of this information is shared within small groups because there is still trust issues, and of course many utilities are concerned about being fined or penalized for revealing information that happens to them, and so sometimes all the best information is not revealed, or all the information is not revealed in any centralized way.
Great, thanks, Gib. I appreciate it. So that kind of wraps up our questions. I just wanted to go off the stage again. If you have any questions that pop up, feel free to reach me, Rick, Steve, or Gib. For those who we didn't get the questions answered, we will certainly put a perspective back in email. And even those who did and we did answer, we'll probably just put together just a light perspective again, because often as you speak on the cuff, sometimes you'll miss an important facet that should have been invited. And the last takeaway on there is obviously you could tell there's a significant, from the questions that came in, questions on resiliency, how it ties in security, physical security, and cyber. So the overall perspective is as you're putting your SIP plan together, that multifaceted approach is really going to provide the best ability to react in a holistic security manner. So PJ, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Steve. And thanks, speakers. Great presentation. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending, and this does conclude today's presentation.